Hi guys, so hopefully now you've watched the crash course video over Latin American independence. And so this PowerPoint is just going to break it down a little bit slower into the different stages. The causes of Latin American revolutions are similar in some ways to the causes of the American and the French Revolution. One major commonality is that they're both encouraged by Enlightenment ideas. So philosophers like John Locke, Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and then American writers who took those ideas like Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine all influenced the people in Latin America. So remember John Locke, he proposed natural rights and the social contract. Voltaire was a big proponent of free speech and less persecution of religion. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau was also a proponent of the social contract. And then Thomas Jefferson took those ideas and put them into the Declaration of Independence. And then Thomas Paine, you might remember from 8th grade history, wrote Common Sense, which incorporated a lot of those ideas and encouraged people in the colonies to want to gain independence. So natural rights, a little review. Natural rights are life, liberty, and property. And in the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson called them unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They all challenged the divine right of kings. So they all encouraged some other form of government, not necessarily a democracy, but something where people had more of a say. And they promoted ideas like free speech, social contract, constitutions, and popular sovereignty. So again, this is something that the Latin American revolutions have in common with the American and French revolutions that we've already studied. Another major cause of the Latin American revolutions, which might be kind of similar to the French Revolution, is that it's caused by social class discontent. So the Creoles were discontent at being left out of government jobs and privileges. So if you look at this is the social pyramid of Latin America, and I would encourage you to go ahead and fill that in again on the triangle on your paper, because it's important to understand. We learned this previously when we studied colonial Latin America. So at the top, we have the Peninsulares. The Peninsulares are people who are from Spain or Portugal, born in Spain or Portugal, European descent. So they're called that because they're from the Iberian Peninsula. Under them, we have the Creoles. The Creoles are people who are European descent, but born in the Americas. Under them, we have mixed race people like mestizos or mulattoes. Under them, we have Native Americans and black slaves. So the Creoles and the Peninsulares, remember, are the same race and ethnicity. But the Peninsulares are treated as higher class citizens, and the Creoles are treated as second class, and so they didn't get the top positions in society that the Peninsulares got, and they were very resentful of that. The people in Latin America had also already witnessed the success of the American and the French Revolution. So they had seen other people rise up against their government and form new types of government. In the Americas, in the United States, becoming independent. In France, forming a new type of government. And so they kind of saw like both the positives and negatives of those revolutions and took the parts that they wanted to model their own revolutions after. Another issue is that this occurred in the early 1800s. In the early 1800s, Europe is caught up in the Napoleonic Wars. So Napoleon is invading and conquering most of Europe. Eventually, he's defeated in 1815. Then they have to decide how are we going to reorganize Europe and put it back together. So there's a lot going on in Europe that's a distraction for countries like Spain and Portugal from what's going on in their colonies in the Americas, because they're very concerned about just maintaining their own country. Like Napoleon conquered Spain, so the Spanish are just worried about, getting Spain back on track. And so they have a little less control over their colonies because they're so focused on what's going on in Europe. And so that creates kind of an opening for the revolutionaries in Latin America to be successful. So you're going to have a separate reading. I think you may have already done it over the revolution in Haiti. So here's a quick overview. This is the first major revolution in the Americas in Latin America. So Saint Domingue or Haiti was one of the richest colonies in the Americas. So they had very large plantations producing cash crops we've learned about. The most important of these was sugar. Now, because we've learned that sugar is very, very labor intensive, the economy was based on slavery, and we've learned that slavery was on sugar plantations was very, very harsh. And so this created kind of a weird social class system in Haiti that eventually led to the revolution. So in Haiti, they had white plantation owners and then a ton of slaves at the bottom, like 95% of their population was slaves. But in the middle, they also had free people of color. So people who were black, but who had freedom and some amount of wealth. And so this created a lot of racial tension. Also, France at the time, who owned Saint Domingue, was distracted by the French Revolution, because this is again in the very early 1800s. And so all of those things created an opening for the slaves to revolt. So the slaves were led by Toussaint Louverture, who you see here, who was himself a former slave. And the French sent troops to Saint Domingue because they're afraid of losing this very valuable colony to try to stop the revolt. But they definitely underestimated how powerful the armies were in Saint Domingue and like how good a leader Toussaint Louverture was and how much slaves really were willing to fight to gain their freedom. They also had problems with diseases because when the French came over, there were tropical diseases in Saint Domingue that they hadn't been exposed to before, and a lot of them suffered, and that weakened their military. And so eventually, Haiti, previously known as Saint Domingue, achieved independence in 1804. Now, this revolution, instead of inspiring other people in Latin America, it really terrified them. So why would this scare rather than inspire Creoles in Latin America? Well, remember, the Creoles are pretty close to the top of society. I mean, they're not happy that they're below the Peninsulares, but they certainly don't envision a society where slaves are free and people of color have a voice. They want to replace the Peninsulares with themselves and still have whites on top of Latin American society. And so seeing this type of revolt where the slaves now are free and have a voice, that's not something that they really wanted to replicate. Now, since we're talking about Haiti, which started as a slave revolt, it's important to touch on that idea and refer back to the Enlightenment. So, motivated by Enlightenment ideas, a lot of societies began to explore the role of slavery and if they were going to continue it and how they're going to deal with this. So the transatlantic slave trade ended in the early 1800s. You might remember from American history that the United States outlawed the international slave trade around, I think, 1807, which meant they still had slavery, but were no longer importing slaves from Africa. But slavery continued in the United States and in Latin America for many years after that. And so slave revolts, like those in Haiti, became more common. There were more and more people who escaped slavery or fled and had to find somewhere else. And so this led to the development of what we call maroon societies. A maroon society is a fugitive slave community. And there were different communities developed in the Americas where fugitive slaves got together and formed their own little community of free people. There was one in the Carolinas, in Florida, which was not yet part of the United States, one in Jamaica, and other parts of South America. All right, we're going to talk briefly about the revolution in Mexico. So the revolution in Mexico against Spanish rule started in 1810 when Father Miguel Hidalgo led Indians and mestizos to revolt. And this is a very famous painting of that. You can see Father Hidalgo in the middle in the black robe. And if you look at the people surrounding him, it's a pretty diverse group of people. Like if you look closely, we have people who look like they're a little bit more upper class. We have people that look like they're lower class. people who, like right behind him, you see Native Americans. So there's all different groups of people. And one of the reasons that this revolt probably did not really take off is that the Creoles, who became the leaders of Latin American independence, were reluctant to join. And again, that's because the Creoles really envisioned a society where they were going to maintain the social structure of Latin America, but just get rid of the peninsulares. And so this vision of somebody like Father Hidalgo, of everyone coming together to revolt and gain independence, was not something that the Creoles were really on board with. And so in 1820, the Creoles led their own revolution against Spain and overthrew the Spanish. General Iturbide, who had participated in that revolt, became king. And so, like I said, you're going to do more about this in your homework, but an important thing to note here is that this is a very conservative revolution, because if you think about what conservatism means, it's like maintaining the status quo, keeping things the same. So they overthrow Spain, but then continue to have a monarchy. So it's not really, they're not forming a democracy or something like that. And Mexico initially was attached to Central America, like you see on the map, as one big nation, but split off later in 1824. So for the rest of this PowerPoint, we're going to focus on the revolutions in South America. So like you saw in the video, Creole leaders had begun organizing in Venezuela for democracy, but they were concerned they did not want to grant freedom and democracy to all social classes. They mostly wanted to get rid of peninsular power and increase their own power. And so these ideas did not really take off because the other people are like, what about us? The mestizos, mulattoes, slaves don't really want to participate in this revolution. And so it didn't really go very far until we have Simón Bolívar. So at this point, you're going to pause the video, and on the very back of your packet, you have a chart. So flip over to that for a second. And I'll go over that with you. So Simón Bolívar was born in what is now Venezuela in 1783. Simón would grow up to become the leading military and political force in the liberation of the northern half of South America from Spain. Below are some of the major events in the life of Simón Bolívar. Read each event, and in the box next to the event, hypothesize how the event might have shaped Simón Bolívar's resolve to liberate South America from Spain. Pay close attention to the dates and places to think about what historical events Simón Bolívar would have been witness to. So think about like the other revolutions that have happened, what he would have seen, and how that would have inspired him. And then just write in the box how this might have contributed to him growing up to becoming the liberator of South America. So go ahead and pause the video. You can do that and then discuss it as a class and then come back and continue. So Simón Bolívar, like John Green talked about in the video, was just really known as a really great leader. So he was motivated by Enlightenment ideas because he had spent time studying in Europe. He was also just a charismatic leader. Like he was the type of person that people naturally want to follow. And I think we all know somebody like that, or maybe you are a person like that, where you just kind of attract people to you and they are willing to go along with what you say just because you're a really good leader. He was also a master of alliances and negotiations, but at the same time, he was known for harsh treatment and misbehavior. So he didn't tolerate dissent among his military or anything that might have torn the military apart. So in 1820, Spain had its own internal revolt within Spain, and this weakened Spanish control of the colonies because the Spanish government was distracted in dealing with this revolution in Spain and trying to stop this revolution. Spain was eventually forced to accept a new constitution that weakened the monarchy and the church in Spain. And so overall, they're very distracted. And so for Bolivar, this is an opportunity. And so he leads his military to liberate or free from Spain, Venezuela, Colombia, and Ecuador. At the same time, like we saw in the video, there's another revolutionary Creole fighter, José de San Martín, who was leading independence movements in the southern part of Latin America. And so if you look at the map here, Simón Bolívar is the purple arrows, kind of going west across South America, and then southward, whereas Jose de San Martin is the yellow arrow coming up north. And eventually they meet up, they liberate Peru, and by 1824, almost all of Latin America was independent from Spanish control. Now, Simón Bolívar was inspired by nationalism, and he really wanted to unite Latin America into an independent state. So he felt like they had a common culture, they speak Spanish, they have a common history. He wanted them to all come together. And this was not really successful. He created this state called Gran Colombia, which you see on the map in orange, and that included the countries today of Venezuela, Colombia, and Peru. But this dream did not really last. I mean, he never united all of Latin America, and even this state, Gran Colombia, fell apart by 1830 over regional differences. Now, John Green also talked about Brazilian independence, so I'll review that real quick. So Brazil, remember, was governed by Portugal. The Portuguese family had fled Portugal and come over to Brazil during the Napoleonic Wars. In 1821, there was a revolt in Portugal, and so the king had to go back to Portugal and deal with the revolt. And so he left his son, Pedro, to stay in Brazil and govern. The Brazilians had seen the revolutions throughout Latin America and started to organize to try to gain independence from Portugal. Pedro supported the revolutionaries, and they kind of saw it as a way to still maintain conservative control over Brazil, rather than like having some kind of liberal revolution. And so he declared Brazil independent in 1822. And so Brazil became a constitutional monarchy with Prince Pedro becoming king. He did institute some liberal reforms like the protection of private property, but overall this was a very much more conservative revolution because they're still maintaining a monarchy. On the very front of your handout, it has a map for you to shade in. So that's what these maps are for. It says to just shade the whole area of Latin America that was independent by 1830. So I have two different slides here. So go ahead and shade in the orange part of Mexico, and notice it extends farther northward into like California, Texas, that region. And go ahead and shade Central America. Just shade it all one color, or even with your pencil or pen. If you need a pause before you go on to the next slide, you can do that. And then go ahead and shade the area of South America that became independent. So notice it's almost all of South America except for like Guyana up in the northern part of South America. And then it also says to draw in the paths taken by Bolivar and San Martin. So again, you can pause the slide here and go ahead and complete that real quick and then move on. So the last thing we're going to talk about is what happened after these revolutions. So the revolutions were successful in that they gained independence from Spain and Portugal, but Latin America still faced issues that continue, I would say, to impact it today. So we're going to talk about what are those issues. The first one is regional fragmentation. So these newly independent governments were relatively weak and unstable, and there were disagreements among different regions over things like, how are we going to collect taxes? Are we going to have slavery in our new country or not? What is the Constitution going to be like? And so an example is Gran Colombia, where Simón Bolívar had wanted to form this Latin American nation, but because people in different places didn't agree on how they were going to be governed, it just fell apart. Another issue is geography and lack of infrastructure. So the Spanish had not built up a lot of infrastructure in the colonies. Like, for example, they didn't have a lot of railroads. And so the geography of Latin America is very diverse. There's deserts, mountains, rainforests, etc. And so to travel throughout different parts of it can be very difficult without a good road system and railroads and things like that. And so that made it very hard to be able to tie all of Latin America together when they didn't really have good transportation or communication systems in place already. Another issue is social inequality and poverty. So In terms of women, Latin America remained very much patriarchal. Now, education did increase for women. Like eventually they had free compulsory education, including women. But overall, Latin America maintained its patriarchy for a lot longer than some other regions of the world. Also, even though social classes were legally abolished, like maybe in the constitution of a country it says there's no official social classes, those traditions tended to hang on and continue. So in a lot of Latin American countries, Native Americans, people of mixed race, free blacks, tended to still have a lower social status than people who were, say, of European descent originally. So these people of color tended to be more likely to live in poverty and more likely not to have representation. And we kind of, if you think back when we studied colonial Latin America and we did an activity where we looked at race in Latin America today, and we looked at the example of Brazil, how like in Brazil, Black people tend to be much poorer than other groups of people, and so the government's trying to take action on that. Like this is an issue that continued long after independence in Latin America. Disparities between social classes and different ethnicities was still an issue. And so an example of that, most of the land in Latin America in the 1800s continued to be owned by whites, and people of color were just hired to work for white landowners or had to rent land or something like that. And so it prevented those groups of people from really getting ahead in society. Another thing that continued after the freedom of Latin America was that the Catholic Church continued to dominate. And this really makes sense, I think, because if you think back, even think back to the Guns, Germs, and Steel video that we watched when Pizarro came and they brought the priests with them when they were first conquering. Like that was a major motivation of the Spanish, was to spread Catholicism and Christianity. And so that became so entrenched in their society that it continued after independence. And we talked about this too, how today Latin America has the largest number of Catholics in the world, like a very growing population of Catholic people, and it's because of their colonial history. So the church had controlled education and intellectual thought. And as these new governments formed and they wanted to form constitutions based on liberal ideas, the Catholic Church often was resistant to that. So, for example, policies like separation of church and state, maybe in the Constitution it said they had separation of church and state, but in reality, the Catholic Church continued to have a lot of influence over people's lives, is basically the point here. Another issue after independence were the caudillos. Caudillos are strong leaders who seize power of governments, usually with military force. So a lot of times these are people who were charismatic leaders. Maybe they had fought in a revolution or a war and they became a military hero. And that allowed them to seize power because they had the support of the military. And then once they seized power, they set up dictatorships, which in a lot of ways is the opposite of what the revolutions had been about, because they're wanting to free themselves from being under the control of the Spanish or Portuguese monarchy and establish a new government, and now they're having a dictator. So an example that you're probably familiar with from Texas history is Santa Anna. So like somebody who had become a military hero, and that allowed him to have the support of the people and then kind of like make his own policies and do whatever he wanted. That's the idea of a caudillo. So they become a dictator and then kind of undermine any kind of democratic government that might have been established. Another issue are unstable governments. So this is a really key thing, I think, to understand. Before you even write stuff down, think about your 8th grade history of colonial America and the 13 colonies. In the 13 colonies, even though they were ruled by the British and the people felt oppressed and like they didn't have a voice, there still was some self-government in the 13 colonies. Like, for example, Massachusetts had its own assembly. The people of Boston had their own city assembly. the Virginia House of Burgesses, which was the legislature of the colony of Virginia. There were people in the 13 colonies that had worked in the government and had an idea of how representative government worked even before they became independent and we became the United States. That's a really key thing because they had people in the 13 colonies who were already experienced with a little bit of democracy. That's not the case in Latin America. So now you can write this down. Spain and Portugal, unlike the 13 colonies, which became the U.S., they had not allowed any kind of self-governing legislature. And so when these countries in Latin America became independent, they didn't have people who already had experience with democracy. Like if you think of the founding fathers of America, a lot of them had served in these colonial legislatures and they already knew kind of like how that should work. They just wanted to do it on a national scale. In Latin America, they didn't have people with any of that kind of experience. And so what happened is they had just a lot more trial and error with their democracy because people didn't fully understand necessarily how a democracy should really work in real life. Like here it is on paper, but what about when we disagree? Or what about when one person wants to take power? How are we going to deal with all those issues? And so as a result, a lot of the countries in Latin America have faced problems with multiple constitutions, where like we've had our constitution since 1787 in the United States, and yes, we've had amendments, but it's been the same constitution. A lot of these countries in Latin America have had many, many constitutions over time as different leaders come to power. The caudillos sometimes seize power, and that creates a new government or an unstable government. There's also a lot of conflicts between liberals and conservatives, like people who wanted more of a monarchy versus people who wanted more of a representative government in Latin America. There were also issues between centralists and federalists. So a centralist, somebody who wants more power in the national government, versus a federalist, somebody who wants power to be shared between the national government and regional governments. So there were all kinds of disagreements that led to more instability in the governments in Latin America after independence. The last thing is also very, very important, which is the dependence of the economies of Latin America on other countries. So even after Latin America became independent, their economies in a lot of ways were very dependent on the governments and the economies of, say, Europe and North America. And this map kind of shows you that. So the industrialized nations of, say, Europe continued to send manufactured goods to the less developed nations of Latin America. And Latin America, in turn, for those manufactured products, sold raw materials and natural resources, which they had a lot of in Latin America, back to them. The problem with this is that Latin America tended to not develop its own industries. So after Latin America became independent, one of the ways that countries like the United States and European countries still had held control is through foreign investment. So countries like the United States bought up lots of land within Latin America, and a famous example is the United Fruit Company, which today we know as the Dole Fruit Company, bought up lots and lots of land. And Latin America, like I said before, was dependent on the USA and Europe for manufactured goods. So Latin America didn't industrialize as quickly, like they didn't build as many factories and start producing their own manufactured products. They tended to stick with buying those from the United States or from Europe. And so many countries developed what's called an export economy, where they focused heavily on the production of a single commodity. Why would this put these countries at an economic disadvantage if they're only exporting one single product? Like say, they focus on exporting coffee. Well, the problem is, what if the price of that goes down on the world market? Then they can't make as much money. Another problem, if you're dealing especially with agricultural products, is you're at the mercy of nature. Like what if there's a hurricane? Or what if there's a fungus that comes in and wipes out that particular strain of crop? So when you're very focused on one specific raw material, and you're not diversified in your economy, you can have a lot of problems if you run into trouble with that one product. And so in the 1800s, foreign goods flooded Latin America, which created large profits for foreigners and a handful of local business people. And this map shows you some of the specific products that were exported. And you can see their raw materials or agricultural products. And so investors from Britain and the United States pressured their own governments to take action if political events or reform movements in a Latin American country seemed to threaten their interests. This is also called neocolonialism. Okay, so pause for a second and think about colonialism, where a country is controlling another country as a colony. That's not what's happening here, because remember, these colonies now are free, independent countries, but the neo, or like new colonialism part of it, is that rather than actually controlling them as a colony, what's happening is the USA and Europe are kind of semi-controlling them through economics. And so that's neo-colonialism, where they're technically independent, but they're still so dependent on these other countries' economies that they're not like fully independent as we would, maybe as they would want to be, because their economy is still very dependent on exporting raw materials and then importing their manufactured goods. So that is an overview of Latin American revolutions. You're going to look at some sources and some different things to help you understand this a little bit better.